Chapter 7. There are times in life when things seem to happen without reason. It all seems unplanned. Yet when we look back, it appears that this was certain to happen. There was a plan, but we could see only part of it, like a jigsaw puzzle with important pieces missing. Such a thing happened to Constance that afternoon. The taxi driver took her to the home of D. Clark. This person was a woman. Constance did not waste time. Luckily, she had asked the taxi driver to wait for her, so there was no time wasted seeking transport. "Please take me to Hillside," Constance said. The taxi driver did not seem happy about this. Constance was beginning to wish that she had used her own transport. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "This is my busy time," he answered. "So what's the difference?" "I'm paying you." "You are one fare," the driver explained. "In the time I run with you round the suburbs, I can make many short journeys." "And make more money," Constance said. "Right. And get more tips," Constance added. "Right again," the driver said, smiling broadly. "Take me to Hillside," Constance said, sitting beside the driver in the front seat. "You'll get your tip." Waiters, taxi drivers and hotel workers always look keenly for extra money. Tipping is not true to our traditions, yet it seems to have become a part of our lives. By the time that Constance reached Hillside, dusk was closing in fast. She knew there was no point in asking the driver to wait for her this time. She paid him, asked for a receipt, and gave him a tip. He did not look too happy. Clearly he had expected a larger amount. The gate was closed. Constance opened it gently and walked along a drive that smelled beautiful in the dusk. Already, the insects that only come out at night were active among the flowers and bushes of the garden. There were no lights on in the house. Constance knocked gently on the front door. There was no answer. She knocked a little more loudly, but still no one answered. Constance tried the handle, but the door was locked. Although it was clear that no one was in the house, Constance went round the back to check. Again there was no sign of anyone present. So she walked to the bottom of the garden to the servant's house, the one that Jacob used. Mrs. Clark had explained that Bokiti had a room in the large house for herself. Neither Jacob nor Bokiti was there. Back at the house, Constance decided, for some reason she could not explain, to check the back door. It was unlocked. Constance was surprised. People who live in villages do not need to lock their doors, many do not even have locks. In the towns and cities, however, where crime is a problem, it is wise to be serious about security. Either Jacob or Bokiti had been careless. They were probably too upset about the death of Mrs. Clark to worry about other things. So it was that Constance decided to enter the house. This was one of those times when fate seemed to be taking a bend in her affairs. The door was unlocked. She might not have checked it, but she had. She went into the house uninvited. On other occasions she would not have done so. She went to the room that had been occupied by Mrs. Clark. She entered very carefully. It was possible that Mrs. Clark's body was in there, waiting for the funeral service. Constance's heart was beating fast. The last thing she wanted was to see Mrs. Clark in her coffin. She was relieved to find that there was no body and no coffin. She switched on the electric light. There was a faint smell in the room. The windows had not been opened that day, perhaps. For this, everything had happened very quickly the last 2 days. So much activity crowded into a short period of time. Constance opened the window to let in the fresh air. She drew the curtains, however, so that nobody would be able to see into the room. This was very unlikely. Of course, the house was some distance from the road. Constance dozed the curtains out of habit. It was what she would have done in her own apartment. She looked round the room. She felt guilty. This was someone else's private room, even if that person was dead. She had no right to be then, no legal right at all. Yet she had a strange feeling. There was something in this room that she was meant to find. Constance opened a wardrobe which was full of clothing. Constance smiled to herself. What else should she expect to find in a wardrobe? It was like opening a refrigerator and being surprised to find it full of food. At the side of the bed there was a locker. Constance checked this too. There were books inside. They were old paperback books, nothing to interest her. On the bed, covering the sheets and blankets, and even the pillows, there was a cover. It was made of silk material. It covered the bed and stretched all the way to the floor. Constance lifted this cover at one side. She knew that people often keep cases or boxes under a bed. It is a good place for storage. There was a single blue metal case. Constance pulled the case out from under the bed. It was quite heavy and she had to pull hard. She hoped to discover papers or diaries in a box such as this. It was unlikely that there would be an address for Daniel. Mrs. Clark would have given Constance her son's address if she had known it. Yet she wanted to know more about the lady who had died. Constance had a feeling that Mrs. Clark had kept something back. She could not be certain of anything. It was a general suspicion that she had, but one that would not leave her mind. Emily Louise Clark had a secret, and Constance Majolo, of all the people in the world, was intended to uncover that secret. Yet even as Constance thought this, she knew that she was treading on dangerous ground. Some secrets, particularly old family secrets, are often best left hidden. The metal box was covered with dust. It seemed as if Bokiti had not cleaned under the bed for some days and that Mrs. Clark had been too sick and weak to do any work herself. There was a strong lock on the box. It was rusty, as if it had stayed unopened for a long period of time. Constance tried to open it, thinking it might not be locked but just too rusty to move easily. She did not succeed. A key was needed. Constance searched the room for the key. She checked everywhere but was unable to find it. Wherever Mrs. Clark had hidden the key, it was certainly not in this room. Now, the sensible thing for Constance to do next was to push the metal box back under the bed, close the window, switch off the electric light and quietly let herself out of the house by the back door. Sensible and legal. She was a lawyer, so she knew that what she was doing was unlawful. Entering a house uninvited and searching through private belongings is not lawful. If she was charged with an offense, it would be very bad. She would lose her job with Tembisa and Associates, that was certain, yet she did not do the sensible or lawful thing. She amazed herself. She was doing wrong, and knew it, and yet could not stop herself. Were some criminals like this? Were they unable to stop themselves doing the wrong thing? Constance knew of people who stood up in court and said that they could not help themselves. It seemed a silly excuse. But now Constance was in that same position herself. And nobody would believe her when she appeared in court, appeared not as a lawyer, but as a young woman accused of a crime. She shivered a little at the very thought. In the kitchen there was a pantry, a little room usually used to store food, tins, and such like. Constance found some tools in this pantry. There was an iron file next to a sack of potatoes. The file was big and strong, just the thing to break a lock. In fact, the lock broke off very easily, because the metal next to it was weak with rust. As Constance lifted the lid of the box, a cloud of dust rose into the air. The dust caused her to sneeze. She looked into the box. As expected, it contained old papers, and under the papers there were photographs. Constance also hoped to find diaries, but there did not seem to be any. She took hold of the papers and removed them from the box. To begin with, the photographs would be of more interest. She thought. The first surprise was being unable to recognize a lady who appeared in many of the photographs. This was a slim, attractive white lady. In some photographs the lady was dressed all in white, as if for tennis. Constance said aloud. Mrs. Clark. It was hard to believe that this healthy young woman was the same person as the weak and thin person who had just died. It was as if Mrs. Clark's illness had eaten away at her body. Only her spirit was left in that bag of bones, and how even that had gone out like a light switched off, or a candle flame smothered. Even harder for Constance to recognize was a man who appeared in several photographs. It was some time before she was able to decide that this man, sometimes serious, sometimes laughing, sometimes dressed in a Sunday suit, but more often in his working clothes, was Jacob, Mrs. Clark's gardener. The man had remained faithful over many years. The succession of photographs made that clear enough. Bokiti appeared in fewer photographs, however. She had not worked for Mrs. Clark for as long a time as Jacob. There were no other photographs of anyone who seemed to be a maid or servant, so it was possible that Mrs. Clark had been a person who did her own housework. Perhaps she employed Bokiti only as she became older and consumed with sickness. There were no recent photographs of Mrs. Clark. She must have decided, as she became sick, that she did not wish this to be registered. Better to let people remember her as she had once been, young and healthy and attractive. The photographs were interesting and Constance spent a lot of time looking at them. By now darkness had closed in. In the garden the calls of insects were louder. Cicadas called for mates gradually. Constance realized that in all the photographs there were two important omissions. Two people were missing entirely. She was unable to find pictures of either Mr. Clark, Emily Louise's husband, or of their son, Daniel. Now why? Constance asked, speaking aloud. This was indeed surprising. People who take photos and keep them, which nowadays is most of us, are proudest of the moments in life that are most important: weddings, the birth of a child, the way in which that child grows and develops, the first day at school, and so much more. In all this collection, in all this room indeed, there were no wedding photographs. And, more significantly, no pictures of any stage in Daniel Clark's life. Constance checked the rest of the box. There were no diaries. Mrs. Clark did not seem to be the kind of person who kept personal record, nor did her late husband, although it was possible that, when he died, Mrs. Clark had disposed of his diaries and papers, just as she seemed to have got rid of his photographs. Perhaps, being a widow, it was best not to have too many reminders of earlier, happier times, but the way in which there was nothing to remind the woman of her child, Daniel. That was for Constance the greatest surprise of all. Constance started to put the papers and photographs back in the metal box. She made no attempt to return them exactly as she had found them. Being dead, Mrs. Clark could not check. It was not likely that Bokiti would care. However, there was the problem of the lock. Constance replaced it, but there did not seem any chance of locking it, because of the rust and decay. Just at that moment, as she was about to push the box back under the bed, Constance heard a sound. Bokiti or Jacob, or both, had returned. She was about to be discovered. It was likely that they had already seen the light in the bedroom, which was at the front of the house, facing the main part of the garden and the road beyond. She would have some explaining to do. It was possible that they would not believe her story. Constance was thinking fast, thinking on her feet, like any good lawyer. She picked up the file. She had better return this to the pantry before the others came into the room. She went out of the bedroom, leaving the light switched on. Turning it off now would not be a good idea. It would be an admission of her guilt. She would explain, if anyone asked, that she had in fact been in the bedroom, but merely to open the windows to let fresh air into the house. She would say that she had been sitting in the front room, enjoying the darkness, having a chance to think. As Constance went into the dark kitchen, fresh air from the back door blew on her face. She had just enough time to remember that she had closed the door behind her when she was grabbed round the neck. She called out. Someone had taken a firm grip on her throat. The file in her hand, which would have been useful as a weapon, fell to the floor. The metal made a loud noise as it struck the kitchen tiles. "Keep quiet," a rough male voice whispered fiercely in her ear. Constance was fighting for breath. The grip on her throat was becoming tighter. She managed to raise her foot and kick backwards, hoping that this would make the man release his grip. At the same time she lifted her right elbow to strike the man in some part of his body. Nothing made him loosen his hold on her. Constance was not finished, however. She struggled and managed to bite the man's hand. He muttered with pain, You little." He did not complete the sentence. Constance bit deep into the flesh of his bare right arm. He had to let her go. Constance took in a deep breath of air. Her throat hurt. But by this time her eyes had become accustomed to the darkness. She tried to reach the floor. The man grabbed her by the hair and pulled her back. She scratched his right arm with her long fingernails. The man grunted like a pig in pain. He struck at her with his right fist and only just missed her. If his fist had landed on any part of her face, especially her jaw, Constance would have been knocked unconscious immediately. Her reaction was immediate. She kicked powerfully. Her shoe struck his groin. Again he grunted with pain. Constance was fighting as hard as if her life were in danger. As the strength of her kick made the man fall backwards, Constance looked up to see who the intruder was. She could make out the shape of his body, the length of his hair, but she could not see his face clearly enough, and then, suddenly, all she could see was the gleam of a knife blade as it cut down through the air towards her face. She had bitten the man's right hand and arm, but he was left-handed. And in his left hand there was a knife. The thief had come armed, and now he was going to cut her face. Or do something even worse. Constance screamed a loud scream that penetrated the evening stillness.